Good morning from Chicago, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Chris Wheat, and I'm director of the George Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. We are excited to begin our two-day symposium commemorating the 50th anniversary of the publication of George Stigler's seminal article, The Theory of Economic Regulation. Through a series of conversations with distinguished academics, including colleagues and students of George Stigler, we will examine his theory's legacy, past, present, and future. Today, we will focus on Stigler's contribution and lasting impact, exploring how his insights influence generations of scholars, and considering what some of his most significant contributions to academia and policymaking might be. Tomorrow, on April 20th, we will discuss whether and how the theory of regulatory capture should evolve to reflect today's market and political dynamics. As a part of this symposium, we invite you to read a series of perspectives on the work of George Stigler on promarket.org, our publication. There you will find pieces from many of this week's panelists, with new pieces being posted throughout the month of April. To kick off the symposium, we are happy to host Professors Andrei Shleifer and Paola Sapienza for a keynote conversation, which will be followed by a larger panel conversation at 12:30 Central. Before we begin, please note that we are on the record and we will post the video on our YouTube channel later this week. If you have questions for the speakers, we will aim to address them in our limited time. You can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And as usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. For more resources, please check out the Stigler Center website, as well as our publication, promarket.org, and our capitalism podcast. The links to these platforms can be seen in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And now, please allow me to very briefly introduce our keynote speakers. You can find their full bios on our event page. Andrei Shleifer is the John L. Loeb Professor of Economics at Harvard University. And joining him, we have Paola Sapienza, the Donald C. Clark HSBC Chair in Consumer Finance and Professor of Finance at Northwestern Kellogg School of Management. And now, Paola, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So my role here is to moderate the discussion. So let me just say a few words. It's an honor to introduce Andrei Shleifer, who was also my PhD advisor many years ago. So this is a little special for me. Andrew is the John Loeb Professor of Economics at Harvard, has made many groundbreaking contributions in so many fields that would take hours for me to make justice of it. So, he has worked in political economy, behavioral finance, behavioral economics, law and finance, institution, and much more. Just for you to know, Andrei is the single most cited economist in the entire world. So no extra additional word, without further dues, I'm gonna pass the stage to Andrei. He will make some remarks on George Stigler contribution for about 20-25 minutes. And in the meantime, I will collect some questions from the audience that you can insert in the Q&A. And at the end, I will select some of them and turn it to Andrei again. Andrei, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks a lot, Paola. And it's really a great honor and a great pleasure for me to participate in this session and to talk a bit about George Stigler's contribution. One thing that is particularly nice for me is that this session kind of brings together, at least for me, three people who have been extremely important for me in my life, in my career. The first is, of course, George Stigler, who's one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, whose paper we're talking about. George played a very large role in bringing me to the University of Chicago in the 80s when I finished graduate school, and he was an extraordinarily important mentor and an inspiration in a lot of my work on political economy. And last but not least, it occurred to me as I was preparing a bit for this, that George published this path-breaking paper when he was 60 years old, which of course poses both an inspiration and a challenge for those of us who have gotten there. The second person is, of course, Paola, who was so nice to introduce me. Paola, as she says, was a student of mine, an amazing student at Harvard some years ago, and went on to a remarkable career as a scholar in both corporate finance and banking, but also a pioneering scholar in cultural economics, but also as a true leader of her school and a business leader. So that's really very special for me. And of course, last but not least, there is Luigi Zingales, who invited me to this event, who is, of course, not just one of the most influential, but also most exciting and colorful and charismatic economists in the world. I'll tell just one Luigi story to start this off. Maybe 15 years ago, maybe longer, he and I had a conversation, and it turned out that he actually attended my corporate finance lectures at Harvard the first time I taught the class in the spring of 1991. And I asked Luigi, how were my lectures? And he thought about this for a second, and he said, they were very, very good, except when you prepared. So I decided to take a lead from Luigi's advice, and rather than have slides and other signs of preparation today, I'm just going to make a few remarks. In fact, I would like to make 3 points, which I think are somewhat more relevant to Stigler's contribution. The first point is that Stigler's paper is, of course, understood by all of us as the fundamental, probably single most important contribution to the economics of regulation, because it changed the focus or changed the perspective on regulation from the idea that regulation is there to cure market failures and is pursued by a benevolent government, to a perspective that, in fact, regulation is acquired by the industry to protect its market power and is far from benevolent in many, many instances. Now, that idea, of course, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the discussion, has been confirmed and illustrated and used very productively to analyze regulation in many, many instances. But I want to make the point that it is also not just the founding paper of economics of regulation, but it is the founding paper of political economy. Before Stigler, the way in which economists thought about politics is in terms of voting and median voter theorem and ideas like that. And what Stigler's paper taught us is that, in fact, the right way to think about economic policy is not just in terms of the median voter and other voting ideas, but rather in terms of exchange between politicians and firms, or politicians and private sector actors. And so what politicians provide on their side is policies that benefit particular constituencies, whether it's firms or groups of voters, and whether it's regulatory policy or protection or some other set of policies or direct financial benefits. And what politicians get in return or in exchange is something from those they regulate. Now, what is that something? Of course, in some instances, it's going to be votes from the favored entities. But the idea is it's not just votes, it's something much broader. So, for example, campaign contributions or campaign cash, thinking about that came out of Stigler's work. Revolving doors, whereby politicians come and take on jobs, take up jobs at the firms they regulate. But also in thinking about developing countries in particular, not just developing countries alone, the Stigler perspective suggests that one way in which politicians get something in return for their policies is bribes. And so much of the economics of corruption, which has actually become quite a significant industry in research and economics with, as you can imagine, a great deal of empirical evidence, is based very much on this Stiglerian idea that of exchange between politicians and firms, which is to say some of what politicians get in return for favorable policies is bribes. And again, there is no denial of the empirical significance of that idea. I should take this even one step further, which is in the original Stiglerian conception, kind of the leading parties in regulation are the firms that acquire protection or acquire support from politicians. Of course, that's not always the case, and you can flip the argument around, which is a lot of what we see in the world, in the data, is politicians introducing regulations, introducing policies, and then collecting favors or bribes or money in return for relief from regulation. So, for example, I've done some work many years ago on the regulation of entry by small firms, where it's very clear that one of the reasons for this regulation is precisely for politicians to be able to extract bribes in exchange for relief. And so again, a productive line of work that led to many things, including something called the Doing Business Report, very naturally followed from this very broad Stiglerian idea of exchange or understanding the nature of the exchange between politicians and the entities they regulate. And I give Stigler an enormous amount of credit for directing, if you like, political economy toward this goal. The second point I want to make, taking this in a slightly different direction, is that although I think that Stigler's is probably the single most important reason for poor economic policies, poor regulatory policies, and so on, there is another one which runs a close second, and is perhaps, at least in my experience, in my reading of the data, is as important reason for bad regulation. And I'm going to make this kind of a big encompassing category of regulator ideology, ignorance, bad ideas, narrow incentives, whatever you want to call it, which is that I think it's a mistake to think that all of bad regulatory or economic policies come from this exchange or from this capture, and that in fact, it's very clear that, to me at least, that often it is the case that ideology or ignorant or narrow incentives play a big role. I'm going to illustrate this. This is probably an appropriate time for this with some ideas in the fight against COVID. And I'm going to make sure that I say some kind of generous things about everybody and not single out any particular group or party. Now, let's start with President Trump's COVID denialism and essentially aggressive policies against masks, against testing, and so on, which probably has cost the United States a few 100,000 lives and maybe millions of infections. Now, you can make the argument that somehow Trump was trying to exchange these ideas for votes, but it seems to me that that's a bit of a stretched argument, a strained argument, in the sense that you could have perfectly imagined a patriotic line of argument or appeal to voters that would, in fact, seek support for the eradication or rapid ending of COVID. Yet none of that happened. Why did none of that happen? Well, it seems to me that we can take the evidence at face value and suggest that the people around the president himself, were ideologically motivated to deny the dangers of COVID and wished to pursue policies that turned out to be pretty damaging. So I think that that's an instance in which you can argue it both ways, but probably ideology and ignorance played as much of a role as any quote unquote rational factors. But just to give you a couple of examples, on the other side, if you think about, and this is again, the European Union and the acquisition of vaccines. Again, I don't have any insider knowledge on this, but it seems to be pretty obvious what has happened, which is the task has been allocated to the procurement agencies within the European Union, who felt that their goal was to get the best price. And so they did get very low prices, but also got some contracts that had the best efforts nature, which basically meant that when there were higher offers from elsewhere, there was no vaccine in the European Union. Now, again, this is not exchange. This is an insane policy that has cost the European Union hundreds of billions of dollars in lost output, probably thousands or tens of thousands of lives. This is not capture. It's pure incompetence, but the source of that incompetence, I think most likely, is just narrow incentives of the bureaucracy to get the best price rather than to think about the broader picture. So again, insane regulatory policy, extraordinarily damaging for no reason at all. But again, just to be fair, if you think about the FDA's slowdown, temporary stop on the use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine after 7 million doses, 7 episodes of blood clotting, and I believe 1 death, a policy that will surely cause tens of thousands of infections and maybe a few deaths, maybe, I don't know, probably certainly more than 1. I mean, what is driving this? Is it capture? Is it efforts by the competitors? No, it's not that. It's rather that the FDA has no consequences if thousands of people get infected, and it has severe consequences if a couple people die. And so you have tremendous distortions in regulatory policies resulting from bad incentives in the public sector rather than from capture per se. I can talk, well, let me briefly mention the $15 minimum wage, which is another moment of intended self-inflicted insanity in the United States. You know, almost a third of the people in the US make less than $15 an hour. Some of them work for firms that may be able to sustain the wage increases, which are the stereotypes that are produced by the advocates of the policy. Probably half of the people who make less than $15 an hour work for extremely unproductive firms that are going to have to close, and there is no way in which they're productive enough to pay those wages. So it strikes me as a purely ideological set of ideas which are going to be extraordinarily detrimental. And again, I don't think that capture is the right theory. I should say one last example of this is that often capture interacts in an interesting way with ideology. So my favorite example, and this is from a work of a PhD student of mine, between 1987 and today, and 2017, so over a 30-year period, the number of fires in the United States has fallen by 43%, and the number of firefighters has increased by 54%. Okay, if you look at the UK, the number of fires has fallen tremendously as well, but so has the number of firefighters. So in the United States, we have this extraordinary phenomenon in which, and it's not, by the way, because having more firefighters prevents fires. It works. Firefighters don't prevent fires. They extinguish them. Anyhow, so what is happening? It's a combination of capture and stupidity. The stupidity is that what the firefighters do in the United States today is they don't fight fires. They chase ambulances. And because there is this notion that somehow maybe a fire truck arrives to a 911 ambulance call a few seconds before the ambulance does. If you actually do the calculations, the benefits of this on lives saved are negligible, if any, and the costs of this increase in the number of firefighters are enormous. These are costs to municipalities that could be saved spending the money on schools and so forth. A truly insane policy. But of course, and this is where Stigler comes in, that once the policy was put in place by people who didn't really understand the facts and the data, they're now extremely strongly supported by firefighter unions, and now are impossible to get rid of. So it's the combination of bad ideas and capture that leads to bad policies. The last point I'm going to make, and I'm going to try to make it relatively quickly, is that, you know, there is another line of thought that Stigler's work has started, and maybe that's not what Stigler intended, which is to say that you know, both of the lines of thought that I've described have to do with bad regulation, you know, whether the regulators are captured or whether they're ignorant, the regulatory outcomes are bad. But of course, that's a bit too simple. and probably wrong, because even though we do see these distortions in regulatory policy, it is also the case that in a civilized society, we're used to many, many regulations that we think on net are beneficial. So we probably like to be flying on safe planes. We like that the food is safe that we eat. We like that the water that we drink and that we swim in is clean. We like that the air that we breathe is less polluted. We like the fact that the cars that we drive are safe. Now, you can say that the market would have taken care of those problems, but it would be wrong to say that, because we have just plentiful evidence from early 20th century US. We have plentiful evidence even much later from air pollution and water pollution that markets do not take care of this problem. You can say that the courts would have taken care of this problem. And this is what people like to say, but that also would be wrong, because we know that in many situations, the courts fail to cure these problems, either for ideological reasons, but probably much more importantly, empirically, because in court contests, in litigation, in most instances, not in all instances, firms tend to be much more powerful, much richer, have better lawyers in the 19th century, better ability to bribe in judges than the consumers or employees who have been affected by these policies. And so, in fact, both historically and up to today, regulation, as often as not, is actually an efficient response to failures in the marketplace. But again, this is in some sense an argument that takes you away from Stigler, but in another sense, it is something that Stigler and Harold Demsetz should get a tremendous amount of credit for, because it is an argument that says that in order to think about economic policy, we can't just focus on market failures. We need to focus on alternative arrangements and on alternative solutions to the problems of market failure. And we actually need to focus on efficient solutions, solutions that survive the competition with others. And so it seems to me that even that way of thinking, which is pretty central to many of the ideas in law and economics, owes a lot to George Stigler. So let me just sum up and finish. Stigler's is not just a great paper, it's also a living paper. It's a paper that even today, 50 years out, 50 years since its publication, provides both intellectual inspiration and, even when one disagrees with it, avenues for going in other directions, in new directions of exploring the world that we live in. And for this, we should all be extremely grateful and appreciative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrei. We have very little time till the end of the session. So I have one maybe main question that connects a number of questions. So if you putting together your first and last point, the first being the enormous impact that George Stigler had on political economy as a field, way beyond his initial germ of the capture element, and then the last point where yet regulation is an important task. Where do you see the economics as a field going? Because at some level we see a lot of political economy and not very much economics of regulation, or not very many job market papers on the economics of regulation. So is it because the field has been exhaustively studied, or is it because it's too specific? What are the rules that we should come up in terms of thinking about optimal regulation metrics?
Well, I can give you my take on this, which is not necessarily right, which is that, in the last 20 years, political economy, maybe 30 years, has been one of the great, tremendous success stories of economics, both because it has introduced a range of new ideas, but also because there is just an enormous amount of data and an enormous amount of evidence that can be brought to bear on pretty important questions. And so as a byproduct of these explosions, you can sort of see how several fields have been, maybe folded is the wrong word, but essentially folded into political economy. So, to my mind, a lot of economic history has been folded into political economy, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. A lot of law and economics has been folded into political economy because the empirical questions are political economy questions. And a lot of economics of regulation has been folded into political economy precisely because, and that's, if you look at the conferences, that's where a lot of papers of regulation are being presented, precisely because that is a large and extremely dynamic field that thinks, if you like, in very Stiglerian terms about all these issues. So I think in some sense it's a very healthy development, although this is not to deny that there are many issues, just as there are in history and in law and economics, that are perhaps more specialized to the field.
So we're almost out of time, and so I think in a way what you are saying is that political economy has been the natural place where to study regulation, and in some way this could be really Stigler legacy. Without thinking about what politician would do, economics of regulation makes no sense, and so in some way that's the right place to do that. I think when we are out of time, and I'm going to pass this to Chris back. I don't know, Chris, we're going to have a pause before the panel. Oh, okay. We still have 5 minutes. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I have one extra question, Andrei, in terms of think about regulation and innovation, especially in transition transition economies, and to what extent these the theory of capture has more relevance in certain developing countries.
Well, I guess I think this is a very, very important question, and it's perhaps, again, part of the integration of regulatory economics into political economy, which is to say that, these issues that Stigler raised are obviously incredibly important in the context of wealthy countries, but they are much more raw, I would say, in the context of developing countries or transition economies or what have you, in which there is less openness, less transparency, fewer countervailing powers, if I could use the term of Stigler's nemesis, John Kenneth Galbraith. And so you see the phenomena that Stigler has talked about in a much cruder, if you like, form. So using, it is really the case that in a developing country, large firms buy economic policy, for money, buy protection, by regulation, and so on. It is really the case that in these countries, there are really no mechanisms that Sam Peltzman and others have written about to mitigate the effects of these antisocial policies. And so if you want to study or understand policy making in the developing world or in middle income countries, perhaps even more so than in the developing world, then Stiglerian considerations come into focus, become very, very central.
Thank you, Andrei. At this point, it's 12:25. I think Chris is taking over, or there is going to be a pause. Yes. You're muted.
We'll pause briefly for a couple minutes. Thank you again, Andrei and Paola. We'll pause briefly for a few minutes and begin our panel at 12:30 Central Time. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll begin in just 1 minute. Good afternoon and welcome back. If you are just joining us, I am Chris Wheat, Director of the Stigler Center. We will continue today's sessions on George Stigler's contribution and lasting impact in just a few minutes with a panel discussion. For this session, we are happy to host Professors Cary Coglianese, Sam Peltzman, and Nancy Rose for a panel discussion chaired by Randy Kroszner. Before we begin, please remember we are on the record and we will post the video on our YouTube channel later. The views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And please submit any questions for the speakers via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And now allow me to very briefly introduce our speakers. Their full bios are available on our event page. Cary Coglianese is the Edward B. Shills Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania Cary Law School. He is also the Director of the Penn Program on Regulation. Sam Peltzman is the Ralph and Dorothy Keller Distinguished Service Professor of Economics Emeritus at Chicago Booth and Director Emeritus of the Stigler Center. Nancy Rose is the Charles P. Kindleberger Professor of Applied Economics at MIT. And our chair today is Randy Kroszner, who is the Deputy Dean for Executive Programs, and Norman B. Bobbins Professor of Economics at Chicago Booth. He is also a former director of the Stigler Center. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Dean Kroszner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and also thanks to Andrei and Paola for a great thoughts on the great man George Stigler. It's amazing that 50 years ago that he wrote this paper, and exactly as I think Andrei had put it, it's something that's alive. It's something that is still being discussed. It still animates the way we think about regulation, the way we think about political economy. And I had spent some time in Washington, both working in the White House at the Council of Economic Advisors and at the Federal Reserve, chairing the Supervision and Regulation Committee. And so I got to see how the sausage was being made. And it is very much a combination of institutions, interests, and ideology that come in. So I could see Stigler's ideas in practice, but also sort of the broadening of the ideas into a sort of a broader marketplace, I think in the way that Andrei had talked about it. And what I'm going to do is turn to Sam to start us off. He also has a very famous paper on towards a more general theory of regulation, where he sort of builds on some of those ideas we were just talking about before and puts them into a broader marketplace context. And so, Sam, why don't you start off?
Well, thank you. I'm going to have a PowerPoint presentation, so I hope this works. How do I, oh, here we go. Okay. Okay, what I'd like to do in this time that I have is I want to address a couple of questions. One is, what did this paper say? And the second is, what is its lasting impact? So I think that what the paper really says consists of four elements. The first is a rejection of what Harold Demsetz used to call the Nirvana Fallacy. I'll explain all of this later. I just want to list them now. He replaced Nirvana with public choice reasoning. And this leads him to an emphasis on a political competition of interests. And finally, of course, why are we here? The synthesis of all of this is his capture theory. So let me begin with the first, which is what I like to call the rejection of the Nirvana fallacy. The Nirvana fallacy in this context is the view of the public interested regulator taming market failures. That's not only that he should, but that he does, by and large, do this. Stigler rejects this because it's not economics. And it's also at this point, he's reacting to a burgeoning empirical literature with which this notion is inconsistent. So what my appraisal of this first aspect is mixed. I think that the public interest story has an enduring appeal. It does go in cycles. The world of the 1970s was a little bit more receptive, I think, to the rejection of Nirvana than we perhaps have today. We can discuss all of this in more detail later if you want, but I do think we're seeing a revival today of what Stigler rejected. The second element is that he replaced Nirvana with public choice, and what that leads to is political competition. This is not original with Stigler, but he certainly forcefully brought it to the surface. He's treating regulators as economic actors. They're self-regarding, subject to constraints. And the constraints include things like rational ignorance and the cost of collective action. And those constraints affect a competition for the regulator's favor, which emphasizes the distributive aspects of regulation as much, if not more, than the efficiency aspects. This competition is going to generally favor the organized and the informed, as opposed to the rationally ignorant and the unorganized. In this context, consumers will be the losers and producers will be the winners. Well, how is all of this fared? I think here there's a more enduring effect, but only up to a point. All subsequent general theory modeling, including mine and subsequent versions of the economic theory of regulation, as an example, there really is no serious alternative to this public choice modeling of the regulatory process as a general model. But what's happened is, I think, that interest in general models has faded. That started somewhere. I think that the interest in general models petered out sometime in the 1990s. Cary actually has a paper on this, which will go into it in much more detail than I have the time for now. But this is true. This is true not just in the economics of regulation. It's true in a lot of areas of economics. There's much more specialization The field has devolved into case studies, and there's also been this revival of Nirvana. How many textbooks that an undergraduate might encounter, or for that matter, how many courses on the economics of regulation that a graduate student might encounter, will devote much time to government failure compared to market failure. So I think that the looking for a general model of regulation has faded, and the point of the public choice modeling has also faded a little bit. Then finally we get the capture model, which is why we're here. The famous quote from Stigler that regulation is acquired by the industry and designed and operated primarily for its benefit. Well, that's the most memorable thing about the paper, but is it true? Okay, and I think it's important to distinguish the origin story from the outcome story, the acquired part from the designed and operated part. Who acquires regulation? Well, sometimes it is the industry. And his paper gives examples from occupational licensing and transportation. But probably that is not mainly what is going on, at least not in the context of the United States and other developed countries, which was the context in which he was writing the paper. There's a whole host of, he was writing just as a whole wave of environmental and social regulation was beginning to bubble up. Most of that was opposed by the industry. Financial regulation, it's either opposed by the industry or the industry is divided. It's the banks and the insurance companies fighting with each other for supremacy. And then we have deregulation, which, how do you figure that in? If the industry captures and gets regulation, why should there be deregulation? For that matter, we have a new phenomenon now, which is the regulator acquiring the industry. Think about wind farms and solar panels and all of that sort of. Those industries didn't exist without the regulation. Certainly not in their form. So it's a tough. Saying regulation is acquired by the industry is tough. The main preference, I think, is for the status quo, whatever it is, because the industry has to make an investment to react to whatever the regulatory background is, and if it's regulation, they're loath to have deregulation. If it's non-regulation, they would resist the regulation for the same reason. When it gets to the design of the operation of regulation, I think you have a more enduring truth. Once you have the regulation, you have a political process, and the public choice elements can't be avoided. All of them, the collective action, the information, they imply interest group competition. The organized and informed group will always include the industry. And I don't think there's been any serious challenge to that aspect of the story. There's another famous, less famous quote that I'm showing you here, which is his reaction to when the economists come back with Nirvana. They say, isn't it terrible that we have pro-industry regulation. And you can see the quote. I have to, the A&P was the biggest supermarket chain of that era. You wouldn't, most of you don't even know what it is. It says something about the dynamics of the marketplace. But it makes a telling point. What do you expect? What do you expect? The industry is going to have an outsized influence on the way regulation actually operates. So I'll close here with the implication and a possible warning for those who are tempted by Nirvana. It is, if you want regulation, things may get better, but be aware that you also get substantial industry influence, cannot be avoided. It will favor incumbents against potential entrants who don't even know who they are. You'll get the revolving door for information reasons, if for nothing else. You'll get complicated rules rather than simple rules. You'll get increased industry involvement in political campaigns. And let's just end with that. If you want to discuss what else you'll get, we can do it later on. So I'm done here.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sam. You can finish sharing your screen.
Oh, you want me to take it off? There.
Perfect. Perfect. We got that.
Good.
No, that was excellent. That's a really great way of saying. I really like your assessment. In one of the times when I was in Washington, the way someone put your last point is, if you decide you think regulation is that you want to propose a regulation, would you still be in favor of it if the people who completely disagreed with you were the ones who to enforce it? And that really gets at that issue. And it really it gives you pause when you're in Washington if you think that, do I really want to propose this regulation? And I think that's a really interesting way to. Nancy, I want to turn to you, because I know that this paper was extremely influential on you becoming an economist. And so I'd actually like to hear a little bit about that, as well as how that's sort of shaped your views on economics of regulation, because you have also been in government, and so you've gotten to see the sausage being made.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Randy, and everyone else for inviting me to speak at today's event. Like Andrei, I owe enormous personal as well as professional debt to George and his work on regulatory economics. And I'll get to your specific question in a slightly roundabout way, which is to say, I basically became an economist because I took a course on the economics of regulation that was taught by Joe Kalt the spring of my junior year in college. And that moved my career path from political science, law, and politics as a way to engage public policy to economics and an MIT economics PhD and a career in academia. And I think it is incontrovertible that without the intellectual vibrancy that was injected into the study of regulation by George Stigler on the positive theory side, and also, to a rough contemporary Fred Kahn on the institutions and policy side, that course would not have existed, and economics would likely have been my path not taken. So I think that this paper, was incredibly important in a somewhat indirect way for creating the course, and in a very direct way for sparking my passion for a study of regulatory economics that's existed throughout my entire career in academia. But George was also a personal influence for me. When I finished my MIT PhD dissertation on trucking deregulation, I mailed chapters to leading economists to appraise them of my work and to elicit feedback. This was in the days before SSRN, before websites, or even an NBER program in industrial organizations. So if you wanted somebody to read a paper before it came out in the journal, you mimeographed copies of it, stuck it in an envelope, put postage on it, and sent it out. that sparked a treasured friendship and mentorship with George, who not only took the time to open that bulky envelope and read the papers, but then invited me to Chicago to present my work at the famous Applied Economics Workshop. I'm not sure that's what it was called at the time, but since that's also the pre-web days, I couldn't nail down the exact title. And that was one of the most exhilarating afternoons of my career, as the give and take with people like George, with Sam, Gary Becker, and others kind of probed what we could learn about regulation and labor rent sharing from the work that I had done. So again, just, accelerating my interest and passion in this. Then a few months later, George called me and said he'd like to nominate me for an Olin Faculty Fellowship. And he hoped if I won it, as he expected I would, I'd spend part of the year visiting the University of Chicago. So I thought, that sounded fabulous. I wasn't quite sure why George expected I would win it, but I then came to learn perhaps George had a little bit of inside information, inside track in that. And so I got the next year to spend a quarter at the University of Chicago, which provided in-depth exposure to George's intellect, his wit, and his passion for discussing economics over any and all meals. I probably can't overstate the influence that he's had on me and on so many others. I wanted to also key in with some of what we've heard about today on this question about the current study of regulatory economics. So I was really fortunate that MIT embraced regulatory economics as a topic for graduate training in industrial organization when I was there in the early 1980s. Now that was at the height of the deregulation movement. So perhaps it wasn't so surprising that a school would devote an entire, half of the sequence, the graduate sequence, to regulation and antitrust. But it's been especially gratifying for me that my colleagues and I have continued to recognize the importance of training scholars in this field in an unbroken thread. I just a couple of weeks ago wrapped up my half course in our graduate economics IO sequence, which starts with Stigler 1971 on the political economy of economic regulation. So, I totally embrace this view. This is not economic history. This is a living paper. And then I sprint through a rich literature on the positive and normative analyses of regulation, talking about both government failure and market failure, spanning markets from electric utilities to transportation, financial services to pharmaceuticals, digital platforms to environmental regulation. I'm hoping that the renewed interest we're seeing in discussions of regulation, particularly of digital platforms and perhaps environmental regulation, will lead us to reinstate such courses at other top schools. Because I think one of the reasons we don't have more work in this space is that students are not being trained in this field. But if I could just say a couple of words about what I think Stigler 1971 has contributed to academia and policy, building on the great discussions that Andrei provided and that Sam has provided. I think it was important not only for dynamiting the conventional thinking about regulation to kind of open up a whole new set of questions and approaches, that if regulatory policy was perhaps the outcome of competition among interest groups for the coercive power of the state, either to create or to protect economic rents, then the work that economists had to do was vast, right? Not only to describe the political economy or why regulation takes particular forms, to build off of Sam's comments about regulatory processes, but also what are the actual impacts on prices, on service, on product quality, on innovation. How do firms respond strategically to those incentives? How should systems be designed to minimize distortions? Going forward to the really important work that Jean-Jacques Lafont and Jean Tirole have done on designing regulation in the face of asymmetric information. And then there's the policy part of it. And I wanted to, Randy, build on your question. So yes, I spent almost 2.5 years in Washington serving in the Department of Justice Antitrust Division from 2014 to 2016, which was a phenomenal experience. And I want to, say that what I've now shifted from is a focus on regulation and regulated industries to thinking much harder and writing much more on antitrust policy. And that's because I think that what has happened, and this builds, I think, really beautiful on the insights that Andrei Shleifer described as, what might not be capture but misguided ideology, I think reflects what's gone on in antitrust policy. And that is that while many scholars and practitioners have proposed antitrust as an alternative to regulation and a preferred alternative, in the words of your colleagues Dennis Carlton and Randy Picker, who describe antitrust as saying no very well, while regulators have a hard time saying no, and that the broad span of antitrust helps to prevent capture. I think what has in fact happened is that we shouldn't be so naive to think that these forces Stigler describes work just in a regulatory context, but not in an antitrust or law enforcement context. Andrei hinted at this when he talked about the forces that might influence judges and judicial outcomes. I don't think that those fundamental forces for the coercive power of the state stop at the door of the courthouse. And I think what has happened over the last 40 years is that a movement also anchored in Chicago, but coming more perhaps out of the law school tradition, began to push for loosening antitrust enforcement, which maybe at the beginning was moving the pendulum sort of toward a more appropriate position. But I think that over the last 40 years, what we've seen is it's become increasingly distorted to protect powerful corporate interests over competitive markets in this kind of combination of capture and ideology, that corporate contributions fund judicial education programs and antitrust that promote theoretical possibilities as empirical fact, fail to reflect existing empirical evidence on anti-competitive behavior, overstate the costs of false positives while understating the cost of false negatives. And that, combined with the susceptibility of litigation outcomes to tilt toward deep-pocketed corporate interests and congressional starvation of enforcement agency budgets, I think has led to under-enforcement of what should be our greatest protection against market power. And I think if we don't recognize that and move the antitrust pendulum kind of back toward a more pro-enforcement stance, we face, perhaps substantial costs as interests that are populist movements that are frustrated by the tilt away from competitive markets, reject the entire kind of economic foundation of that system. So I think it's not just a living paper and living set of insights for regulatory policy, but I think we ought to now be turning it toward antitrust policy as well.
Great, that's really, really very, very, very insightful, and actually a perfect setup for Cary, who is one of the world's experts on administrative law and thinking about regulation. Cary has written a lot in this area, so I think I'd love to get your views on the influence of Stigler's paper, but also maybe pick up on some of the themes that Nancy talked about regulation, antitrust, and the legal process.
Sure. Thank you, Randy, and all the organizers for the invitation to be here today. And, it is the case, as others have said, that Stigler's theory of economic regulation has been one of the most influential works in the political economy of regulation. It's an article that's still worth talking about today, 50 years later. And I'm happy to talk about what I think are some of the influences that it's had in the field of regulation and administrative law. But I have to start by saying something that maybe sounds a little bit heretical in the context of a commemoration event like we have today. I think most readers reading the paper today might well be forgiven for thinking that the paper probably couldn't be published today. And so I want to start by just highlighting a few weaknesses of the paper, but then go on to explain why, nevertheless, I think the paper has enjoyed so much impact in the world at large, impact on regulatory scholarship, impact that is, I think, truly deserved, notwithstanding what I think are probably 5 limitations or weaknesses of the paper, and I'll just say these briefly. I mean, the first weakness is it overclaims. Sam put up with a famous statement, but left out actually 3 words at the beginning of Stigler's famous statement, where he said, "As a rule, regulation is acquired by industry and designed and operated primarily for its benefit." So there are some statements in this paper that are what we might think of today as being a little less than careful, and I think certainly provoke criticisms that are leveled against Stigler today even. A second weakness, I think, is some of the key concepts that he uses are not very well specified in the paper. At times, he treats industry, for example, as if it's a monolith, the industry in his famous statement. He treats the state and the regulator as a monolith. He treats business influence or rights of it sometimes as if it's binary. Regulators are either subservient or they are not. And I think there's some conflation or blurring, or at least lack of clarity at times, between what Sam called the origin story and the outcomes, the impetus for legislation and the way regulation is made. That's a weakness. A third limitation or weakness is it's not totally original. There were political scientists in the 50s, Samuel Huntington, Marver Bernstein, who were writing about business influence and capture of regulators. A lot of the underlying theory that Stigler applies actually, owes to Mansur Olson's work before him. So that's, it's always true, of course, there's no new thing totally under the sun, and scientists and economists and scholars build on the work of others, but that's just worth putting out there, that this is not like the first time that people discovered that business was having some influence on regulators. A fourth limitation is with the empirical analysis, which I think people looking at today would find far from compelling or rigorous. Two case studies of state-level regulation in trucking and occupational licensing, very simple regressions. Even Stigler acknowledged that the results were not very robust. He presented what he called a modicum of evidence for his theory. And a fifth limitation, and I think this Sam already also alluded to, is that the theoretical claims that he was making seem to have been overtaken very soon after the article was published by events on the ground. The death of economic regulation, or the deregulation movement of the 70s and 80s, and the birth of social regulation, consumer environmental regulation in the 1970s, didn't seem to quite fit what he was getting at. So 5 limitations or weaknesses, but yet here we are talking about Stigler's theory of economic regulation 50 years later. Despite these flaws or limitations, it is an important and influential piece of scholarship. It's worth our continued engagement with it 5 decades later. And there's no denying it. It's had an important impact on economics, on political science, and on law. In some sense, I think we're all Stiglerians today. When it comes to law, legal scholarship and the decisions of judges have been highly influenced in the field of administrative law, that body of law with rules that govern government agencies, by concerns about regulatory capture. Interestingly, the word capture is not ever included or used by Stigler in his theory of economic regulation, but nevertheless, that emphasis and concern about regulatory capture just really took off in the years following 1971. And as just a simple exercise to identify the influence Stigler and this article, in fact, has had on legal thinking, I ran a search of citations for his article and compared them with citations to 4 earlier major works that articulated a capture theory: Samuel Huntington's work, Marver Bernstein's work, historian Gabriel Kolkel's work, and Ted Lowy's work as well. And Stigler's paper has been cited 3 times as many as all 4 of those other works combined. It has affected how judges think about standing doctrine and the access to courts. A standing revolution, it's sometimes said, occurred in the 1970s, owing to a concern about the courts being just too much affected by business groups, and there was an expansion to allow environmental groups and so-called public interest groups to come into play. Doctrines about judicial review and the scrutiny of regulations, transparency. It's no accident the Government and Sunshine Act was enacted in 1976 in this period of time of concern about regulatory capture. So what might explain the appeal and the influence of Stigler's work, notwithstanding its flaws? I think I would probably say there's about maybe four plausible explanations, and I just want to highlight those because I think they reflect some of the virtues and the value of the work today. I mean, I think the first reason for its influence is it tells a dramatic story. I mean, the drama comes from turning what most people at the time accepted as the hero into the villain. The public interest theory, the Nirvana theory, held that regulation was there to promote public welfare. It was the savior in the face of market failure. And yet Stigler then comes along and reveals, wait a minute, the reality can be quite the opposite. What looked to be public interested is actually advancing private interests. It's a bit like the murder mystery where the really nice guy turns out to be the murderer, or if any of you have small children, you probably have watched the movie Frozen at least once, and it's a bit like Prince Hans, who first seems to fall in love with Anna, but in fact is only manipulating her to try to scheme and take over the kingdom. That's dramatic, and that's part of, I think, what is so appealing about Stigler, and so important, though, too. And that leads to, I think, a second explanation for its influence. I think it's more than just a compelling drama. It's actually capturing an important part of the reality of the regulatory process. Business interests simply do have a lot of influence, and the public interest theory that held sway at the time Stigler was writing was indeed too Pollyannish or naive. And yes, and businesses don't always win. There are counterexamples to business dominance, that deregulation and environmental regulation can, but there's also no denying the power of industry too. I mean, the 1970s did see a lot of environmental legislation passed by Congress, but how much has been passed since? It's been almost 20 years now since the United Nations has really recognized climate change as a serious problem. We still don't have federal legislation, and the kind of environmental regulation that EPA has adopted under climate change has been relatively limited and litigated too. So I think Stigler's concerns about business influence still ring true today. I mean, occupational licensing is another example that is still talked about today. And political scientists all the way from E.E. Schatzsnyder in the middle of last century to Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker today, I think, are reminding us of the power and influence of business in the policy process. A third, I think, reason is I don't think some of the criticisms and limitations against Stigler sometimes are based more on a caricature than a real close reading of the article. Stigler did write some passages that one can pick out and criticize as overclaiming or maybe seeming too simplistic. But if you read the paper carefully and study it, which I think is worth doing, he recognized that industry was far from monolithic. He recognized that not every regulation was there to advance industry. And last, I think the fourth reason why this has had such an impact and influence on both scholarship and on policy thinking is it emerged at a time when I think academics and society more generally was just receptive to this idea. We have to think back. In 1964, trust in the federal government was at its all-time high. 77% of the public, when surveyed, said they had high levels of trust in the federal government. But Vietnam happened, the civil rights movement happened, Watergate happened, and by 1974, that level of trust was cut more than in half, down to 36% or so. So we have had this paper coming along historically at a time of considerable skepticism about government, lack and with removal of faith in government. And this was happening on the left and the right. The left saw the government as in the pocket of corporations. The right saw the government as interfering with positive market forces. And quite frankly, this is still true to this day. We have on the Regulatory Review, which is a publication we put out at the Penn Program on Regulation, a special series on capture that we ran about 5 years ago. And it has an essay by Senator Elizabeth Warren and an essay by Senator Mike Lee, both of them decrying regulatory capture. So in the end, I think we are here to celebrate an influential and important work for bringing to light a key underlying mechanism for much of regulatory policy, that is self-interest, and for pointing to the need for a better way of and a more careful way of thinking about institutions and their design and how that can affect the shape of policy by affecting the interests of those who are involved in making it. It's not just a paper that is a theory of economic regulation, but it is really the foundation for an economic theory of regulation, foreshadowing and providing a grounding for a lot of rational choice work on regulation and on regulatory procedure. And I think one thing that the scholarship on administrative law has shown over the years is that procedures too, as much as they may help counteract or may be useful in trying to address regulatory capture, they too, those procedures can be manipulated and influenced for political gain as well. I think, ultimately the aim, the normative aim of regulation is to make the world a better place. And I think Stigler actually helps us on that path. He separates out the positive from the normative and forces us to recognize that, yes, there can be market failures, but there can also be government failures. And then he says we should go and try to study empirically and understand the world, how it does operate, because I think in the end, that's the only way we can work harder and do better to make the world more like what it should be.
Great, that's really interesting. I think it gets at some important points that Nancy and Sam had raised, in thinking about what is the best instrument and how do different groups use different instruments, because the institutions themselves can either make it easier for people to organize or less easy for people to organize, or for different groups may be able to use different institutions in different ways. And so it's something, it's much more general than just it's a given that you get capture in this particular way. It really makes you think about the design and implementation as being very important for who is going to end up having influence. I'm glad you mentioned Gabriel Kolko, because that's actually how I got into all this. Before I got to college, I had actually read Gabriel Kolko's work on railroads and regulation, because the ICC was really one of the first interstate regulatory bodies that came in the US, and it very much was something that really strikes me as I remember, even though I read that more than 40 years ago, was that the lawyers for the industry group actually were doing some of the drafting of the legislation. And so that was sort of a clear example of that. Obviously, not all cases are like that. One other thing I want to note is that something that's sort of ironic, given what we've been talking about on sort of capture and regulated industries, and also getting back to what Nancy was talking about the educational role that sometimes can be used by industry groups. George's paper was published in the Bell Journal of Economics. And the Bell Journal was, people may not remember this because there was a telephone monopoly in the US, and there was a lab, the Bell Labs, that the monopoly generated a lot of profit. And so they did a variety of supported a variety of things, including supporting a journal on microeconomics and regulation. And so it's sort of interesting and ironic that that George's paper was published in there. We're starting to get some questions in, which is really great, and so please continue to put more in. The one from Stephen Skilvas actually really nicely touches on some of the things that you were talking about, Cary, as well as some things you were talking about Sam. I think that, so let me read or sort of paraphrase it. How should we be thinking about these processes, and especially when there are multiple actors and multiple interests? So should regulatory design focus on a process where the influences of competing interests are balanced, given that some of these interests are highly concentrated and others are diffuse? So really thinking about the design as an important part of affecting the outcome. I know, Sam, do you want to, because you had touched on this, I'm thinking about the distinction between the origin and outcomes. Do you want to chime in, and then maybe Nancy and Cary can come in? Sam, you're on mute.
Okay. You can overstate, I think, the degree to which the design of the regulation is going to affect the outcome. I mean, it's all very general, and of course, in principle, I can agree with it. But you cannot, I think, overstate that whatever the design is, the public choice elements at play will surface. So I can't think of any design which is going to make a public utility commission not worry about the utility that it's regulating and the employees who are organized. I can't imagine how design affects that. I will say this, that one of the things that Stigler left out that Cary alluded to was the Stigler view is not heavy on design. It's been called a black box theory, where the state, the legislator, the regulators are all kind of lumped into one. And it took a lot of unpacking of that black box later on. I think the unfortunate thing from a theoretical perspective is that worrying about these broad general problems kind of has receded into the background, and we're more into the world that Nancy described, which is, okay, what are the facts about the particular case? And I think that's a little bit unfortunate, because it's clear that the political background matters, the power structure that goes from the political marketplace through the legislature, through the establishment of regulation, through the procedures that the regulator will follow. Those are all important. For just a couple of historical facts. There has never been a wave of regulatory growth without a democratic Congress. Clearly, it's not just some undifferentiated state with some undifferentiated legislature that's producing the regulation. It happens in certain environments and not in other environments. We didn't have enough time to go into this, but there's a whole subsequent literature on how these forces get filtered through, in particular, the American legislature. Guys like Ken Shepsley and Barry Weingast worried about these kind of problems and made some very important contributions. So I can agree with the question, but I also don't want you to lose sight of the fact that whatever the mechanism, there's going to be a political public choice element that you can't escape.
Nancy, did you want to touch on this design question?
I was going to let Cary, because I think this is his
Okay.
Main area of expertise. Although I'd be happy to kick in if he doesn't. I'm sure he will cover it more than I would. But
Well,
why don't
I might say different things than you would too, though, Nancy.
Yeah.
So, but feel free to, come after me. I'll be somewhat brief too, so we can get some more questions in. I mean, to some extent, the question asking about balancing and designing a process that can sort of channel interests and make sure that they balance each other out is a very old idea going back to the founding of the United States. It was Madison who said that, really the dangers in a democracy is the power of factions, right? And you need to design some structures so that ambition can counteract ambition. So there's something, I think, certainly to the questioner's intuition here, and it is reflected in what we saw developing in the 1970s when we had not only new legislation that was enacted to protect consumers and environmental interests, but we also saw at the same time, and Jack Walker, the late Jack Walker, political scientist, showed this, I think, most clearly. We had, after this legislation was passed, really just a flourishing of new interest groups forming in Washington. And so we now have something that, quite frankly, wasn't really too predictable either from Mansur Olson's work or I suppose George Stigler's work too. The institutionalization of an environmental lobby in Washington, D.C. to somewhat counteract. Now, I don't think anybody would ever say that they're on equal footing in terms of the resources and the capabilities, but they do have a degree of balancing, and we see structures of procedures that have allowed them to participate, that have given them greater awareness and transparency about what government is doing so that they can be activated. They have had expansive standing in court. And now, of course, these things have been contested too. And I think the same politicization, if you will, that may not have been Nancy's word, but of the judiciary is certainly at work in rethinking. And we see conservative justices wanting to rein in the ability for, say, environmental interests to get access to courts, and a restriction of standing doctrine for that reason. So yes, balancing, I think, is a long-standing notion. I agree also, though, with Sam that it doesn't erase the fundamentals that people will be acting in their self-interest, but nevertheless, it is, I think, a structural response that we have seen, and I think we've seen again George's work being highly influential in the movement toward creating those institutional designs.
Maybe the one thing I might add that's sort of taking us in a slightly different direction, but given how well Sam and Cary covered that, is to go back to something that I remember if it's Cary or Sam said, maybe Cary, I think, does the deregulation movement in the 70s kind of falsify Stigler's theory? And I think that's super interesting, probably because that's, when I came of age as an economist, was in the middle of that, and spent time in Washington as the trucking deregulation was kind of moving through the system in halts and fits. I think it doesn't, and I think partly why is because that movement took place, although it does complexify maybe the theory. So first, that deregulation movement took place when we had a massive shift in the costs and incidence of economic regulation. in industries that were probably, fundamentally structurally competitive. So kind of classic Stigler capture, legislative capture industries, like trucking and airlines. Industries where the energy crisis had substantially increased the cost of inefficiencies that the regulatory system created in both trucking with empty backhauls and circuitous routes, and in airlines with very low load factors, so very high costs per traveled passenger mile. And so, I think the theory does suggest, and maybe there is this status quo bias as well, but it does suggest that there are these massive disruptions that kind of change winners and losers and how they perceive things. We might expect a change in the regime. I think the other interesting thing about, so to take, for example, to take both airlines and trucking, is the role of this kind of ideology and ideological entrepreneur, with Ted Kennedy playing that role in Congress with respect, and Stephen Breyer having a role in advising him with respect to airlines and then trucking. And then Fred Kahn, who somehow we got into the CAB as the chair. I think that's what's super interesting to contrast the US and the UK, where the UK has these expert regulators drawn, say, from academics, not from industry. The US tends to have political regulators drawn from, say, congressional staff or industry. But where Fred Kahn came in with a clear vision of what the costs of airline regulation were, and he tweaked the rules he could tweak in a way that I think basically took a few of the airlines that had been massively opposed to airline deregulation and convinced them, gee, if I've got to live with this guy, I'd rather be deregulated. And so again, altered that kind of constellation of interests and forces. Anyway, a little bit of complexity to what Stigler has in this paper, but I don't think George would have disagreed with any of this, right? I think you're right, Cary. He was viewing this as a very stylized model. I think what is so compelling about this is it gets us all talking about it.
And I think, at least I certainly don't think there's a tension with deregulation, and like the work that I had done on deregulation of banking in the 1970s, 1980s. Really, it was an interest group competition approach. And there were some shocks that came in that affected the relative costs and benefits to the different groups of the regulation. Something is what might seem so odd now is like the development of the 800 number, so that you didn't have to bank locally, you could bank anywhere, and it didn't cost you a fortune because you had the Bell telephone monopoly, so it was very expensive to call long distance. But with the invention of the 800 number, then you could bank with anyone, anywhere. And so it dramatically changed, that technological innovation dramatically changed the landscape.
Disintermediation of banking, right? Because of the binding regulation Q ceilings on interest rates that led huge outflows of deposits to money market mutual, led to the creation of money market mutual funds and huge outflows. And again, kind of change how the entrenched interests see their future.
Yeah, so I think it's very, because what I think is interesting, it gets you thinking about exactly these issues, because it is about interest groups and interest group competition, but things can change. And exactly as you had said, Nancy, if you have a very clever person in at the as the regulator, they can think about the endogeneity, and they can think about by changing some of the regulations or making some changes, perhaps changing the balance. Whether it's divide and conquer, or whether it's getting people to organize more easily. I think it's also very interesting, and actually I'd like to ask the panel about technology today. And how do you think that is changing this competition among interest groups? Because Nancy, you had mentioned obviously thinking about digital platforms. So there's issues around that and antitrust. It's also related to one of the questions that came in about natural monopoly and public utility type regulation. Is that an alternative of either having government ownership or having a public utility regulation for this area in some of these digital platforms? But also more broadly, how is digital changing the information flows, the potential for providing either good information or not so good information? How do you think that is changing this sort of marketplace? and then if you have something specific on the digital platforms themselves. And Nancy, why don't you start?
Yeah, so great set of questions. I'm not sure I've got answers to them all. I will say, I think, you know, I think probably the potential for good is less than we might hope in terms of, you know, freeing up information flows. But as you kind of already hinted at in framing up that question, Randy, I think the potential for misinformation flows is just as large. And again, if you have interests that benefit from misdirection or misinformation, if they benefit a lot, you know, we should expect to see that out there. I think, you know, to take this home to where we all live in academia, one of the things that worries me a lot, and this kind of, I had thought about the Bell Journal, the Stigler paper being in the Bell Journal, and had decided maybe that wasn't on my top list of things I wanted to say, but, you know, that was an interesting, you could think of that as, you know, the Google equivalent is, you know, we're going to sponsor a journal. It was the premier field journal in industrial organization for decades. I'm not saying it's not now, but I'm just, Bell's hasn't been involved in it for a long time. And it did publish papers, you know, it had an independent editorial board, but certainly some of the work that was coming out of Bell Labs and published in the Bell Journal was work that was favorable to the interests of AT&T. You know, today the analog of that is, you know, there's a lot of academic work that is being funded by, I won't say sponsored, but funded or supported by digital platform companies, often with not great transparency. You know, and I don't just mean, you know, the Googles and Amazons and Facebooks of the world. You know, Qualcomm, to take a company that's not a platform company, but is a tech company, you know, has had decades of very successful penetration of its line, its interest push into academic publications that don't get any recognition of being supported or funded by Qualcomm, and often are really trash in terms of the academic quality. I'll just put it out there. And yet those papers then get picked up and cited because they're, quote, peer reviewed. So I think in academics, we've got, and academic economists, we've got a lot of room to sort of clean our own house and figure out how we avoid becoming complicit in kind of interest group politics to change regulatory outcomes. So that doesn't answer your question. I'll see if Cary or Sam have got answers to your digital platform regulation question, but something that's been on my mind more and more lately.
I can offer two
Cary?
thoughts. One thought about sort of the substance of regulating these digital platform companies that I think is an important point that Stigler leads us to think about, even though I don't think he directly really acknowledged it. And that is that sometimes regulation might well be to the advantage of incumbent firms, but nevertheless also to the advantage of the overall public. And you know, if the Facebooks and Googles and Amazons and Apples of today could figure out a way to really make some meaningful progress on, let's say, the problem of misinformation, but if it were costly, it could both inhibit innovation in that area and be to the, you know, in that sense, advantage of these incumbent digital platforms, but it also might really solve an important social problem. And then the question is just really whether, you know, the welfare gains from the regulation that's solving the misinformation problem is, you know, sufficiently outweighing the costs of whatever drag on innovation there might be. And, you know, that's an open empirical question, but at least it suggests that you don't, it's not an either or. Sometimes regulation can help private firms, but also help the broader public too. So that's one point about the substance of it. The second point, and I think this goes to part of your question about how these platforms are affecting regulation overall. I think the rise of social media is really transforming the kind of the political environment within which a lot of regulators are operating. And I'm seeing this in particular at the state level a lot these days in areas of regulation that have for decades been really backroom kind of operations where the regulators and the industry know each other, they go fishing together, whatever. And you see this with oil and gas and other types of electricity regulators overall. And that's how they operated for many years outside of the limelight, without, say, the same kind of media attention or even the kind of transparency rules that we can see at the federal level. But now with social media and anybody with a blog and so forth, we are seeing that, and they're telling me too, like our world has really changed. We've got to be much more careful today than we ever did before. And I do think that that is a part of the political life today, that there's greater visibility and greater dialogue, discourse, and attention and cascading that can occur, and regulators can be caught up in the middle of that in a way that they never had before.
Sam?
Well, you can count me as a skeptic about all of this. I don't see anything in the rise of the digital platforms that is particularly novel or troubling. I have not heard anybody articulate a state of the world that would be better if you had some regulatory, greater regulatory oversight. I think the degree of monopoly is vastly exaggerated. I don't think there's a major antitrust concern, but I haven't heard anybody articulate what that concern really is in antitrust terms. What is the remedy that an antitrust court can impose, and how it will make the world better? The one thing I am sure of is if the current stampede toward regulating these platforms gains momentum, then the competition will be less. Valuable innovation will be stifled, and the incumbents will have disproportionate influence over the process. So what I'm sure of right now outweighs some fanciful problem that somebody could invent. Again, I think much of this is the Nirvana fallacy revived. Oh, there are these problems. There are the problems. I can see Cary is a lawyer and I'm not, but I can see constitutional issues where the censorship of these platforms, if it's to curry regulatory favor, seems to me to be constitutionally problematic. So there are problems, but you have to take a wider view. How is the world going to be better if you regulate, given everything that we're here today to worry about?
Excellent. I knew this question would get some different answers and get some controversy going. So
Can I jump
sure,
in?
please.
Yeah. So I do not think that we should minimize the problem of designing any type of regulatory solution. I am particularly nervous about.
Tell me what the problem is first.
Okay, so Sam, I think there is. I think there is a problem with undercurrents of anti-competitive exclusionary behavior in these sectors, and I think that has led to substantial barriers to entry, even above what the underlying technology would give us. So I think the platform sectors have just naturally high barriers to entry or tendencies toward consolidation, where competition for the market is much more important than competition in the market. But I think because of decades, honestly, decades of under enforcement of monopolization antitrust law, we don't deter anti-competitive behavior. We have not. I think that's what some of these lawsuits that we've already seen filed in this space are reflecting. And I think if we want, I mean, this is what I was trying to say, if we want to avoid a kind of populist rush to policies that are not going to necessarily improve economic outcomes, we should be incredibly committed to enforcing competitive markets however we can. And I'd like to see, I don't think antitrust is going to solve many of the problems that those who are upset with the current platform sectors are flagging. I don't think, personally, I'm not sure, I don't see how a divestiture or disintegration of these companies works for the particular problems that we're talking about, with some few examples, a few exceptions perhaps. But I think more effective deterrence of exclusionary behavior is absolutely essential. And I think that starts with better funding for the enforcement agencies so they actually have the time and resources and staff to be able to bring challenges. I think it requires courts to reject kind of simplistic views that say, you know, markets are always tending toward competition. If there are monopoly rents, somebody will come in and compete them away. We just don't see that, particularly where we don't protect against exclusionary behavior. So I think we need to do something more in the antitrust enforcement space. And then I think we may need some kind of light touch regulation. So, you know, something like, and I don't know how this works. I'm not saying I've got the answers, but something like when we wanted to get more competition in the telecom space, we had number portability. We had already interoperability in the telecom space, right? That allows a new firm to come in and begin to compete. So maybe we need to think about kind of these light touch regulations that are not draconian price and entry and scope of business regulations that are dangerous in terms of innovation in fast moving markets. But, you know, how can we begin to level the playing field?
You know, I would just add, you know, Nancy's laid out very well the argument for there being a problem, a market failure from the standpoint of a concentration of market power. That's a classic market failure. There's others that people raise here. I mean, information asymmetries, people are participating on these platforms, but they really don't know what's happening with their data, with their privacy. That is a regulatory problem. There are externalities to, you know, you can think about the spread and diffusion of falsehoods and conspiracy theories as a form of idea pollution, perhaps. I'm not saying that these are problems that, you know, regulation can solve or that they justify government intervention of any sort, but they're problems, I think, that are associated. And I think we'd be deluding ourselves in saying that the digital platforms are problem-free.
Tim, did you want just a quick final word on this? Because I then have one question that I want to conclude with in a different area.
You talk.
Sam, did you want to?
No. Go ahead.
Okay, good. No, I think this is an extraordinarily interesting area, and so obviously the Stigler Center does an annual conference on this, so I think that's a very interesting thing to go down. But Cary, it's interesting because you've talked about both the positives and the negatives, because you said now with these platforms and these and blogs and such, there's much more transparency now at the state level, much more monitoring, but also you've talked about the potential for misinformation that's coming out. And I think it's very interesting because both possibilities are there, and thinking about, you know, the difficulty of making sure that if you try to reduce the problem side, that you don't harm the positive side. I think that's a really, really challenging thing going forward. But the final question comes from Jake Jarris, which I think is an excellent one to conclude with. Advice for PhD students interested in the economic theory of regulation. So what's at the cutting edge? What are the areas that you think new research should be focusing on, and what are the subfields where we're making some of the most progress. As he mentions here that Andrei had mentioned the non-capture aspects of political economy of regulation, regulatory incentives, competence, ideology. And so maybe just a quick, because we're almost at time, just if you have a quick thought or two for giving advice to researchers going forward.
Let me start. I'm a journal editor, so I face the oldest journal editor in the history of economics journals, I think. But I face this every day, and my advice to somebody at the PhD level is, it's very unfortunate, but you do what it takes to get out, and it is not going to be. I dislike saying it's not going to be asking the kind of questions we've been dealing with today. Why do we have regulation? What can you expect in general from the operation of regulatory agencies? It's very likely to be a much more specialized look at particular kinds of regulation. You're getting it now. You're getting a tremendous opportunity now in financial services. 10 years after the Dodd-Frank Act, you can begin to ask what's been the effect of it. I have my own views, but I'd like to see a detailed, well-identified, blah, blah, blah kind of study of the effect of some aspect of that regulatory change on some aspect of the financial services industry. So that's the way you're going to go. And I do not, it is not my advice to somebody at the PhD level to take on the questions that I think still need to be, the general theory kind of interest in that petered out in the 1990s. It's not because the problems were solved. It's because the profession just moved in a different direction, not just in regulation and political economy, but just moved in a different mode. So, young man or woman, whoever asks the question, don't fight it. Don't fight the establishment.
Cary, and then I'll give the last word to Nancy.
Sure. There's, I think, no shortage of need for ex post retrospective empirical evaluation of regulation. We've got a lot more theory and analysis that goes on before regulations are put in place than we have a body of research of what's happening after the fact. So that's one thing. Another opportunity, it seems to me, we've got an emergence of behavioral economics and the use and study of behavioral economics as a strategy for shaping behavior in the world. I think there's still very little about the behavioral economics of regulating and regulator behavior. And the third area, I think, and it's probably the one in some ways that's closest to what Stigler was pointing to and what political scientists have for many years focused on it, whereas politics is being about who wins, who loses. We have a paucity of knowledge about how regulation affects inequality and what the incidence of the benefits and costs of regulation are. And I think if PhD students or other younger scholars can add to that question, I think that would be important.
Great. Nancy?
Yeah, so I would just echo Cary's last point. I think that's absolutely true. There used to be a little bit of work on incidence of regulation, particularly say across different customer groups or whatnot, but there's been relatively little of it recently. I think the behavioral angle is also quite interesting, both in terms of regulatory design and in terms of regulatory behavior, right? So JOSCAL 74 is a paper that I tell every single PhD student I talk to they need to read. It's a super, super important paper. It's one of the earliest embodiments of behavioral economics in regulation, the study of regulation and IO in general. But there's been like almost nothing that's kind of come since then that's built up on that. I think in general, there's a lot of interesting work that's being done on regulatory design and a bit on regulatory impact. You know, we saw a few job market papers this year that looked at that. Certainly, you know, MIT has got a history of students that have come out, not a lot, but students that are coming out that are looking at the impact of regulation. And I think especially in environmental and energy economics, there is a lot of this work that's being done. That's kind of an applied regulation field where it's got enough scholars working in it that some of the more methodological pressures of IO are a little less important. And so you can ask maybe slightly bigger questions like the ones Sam wants you to ask than you can if you're just writing a straight IO dissertation. So ideas.
Great, really helpful. I'll actually make a plug for the FDA, an area that Sam has certainly worked in. With the pandemic, there's a lot of interesting innovation that has gone on there, and looking at that. Also, like Operation Warp Speed, and then the different approaches that different countries have taken to vaccine acquisition. I think that's, and rollouts. You've got this great set of variations across countries. And so I think there's a lot potentially to do there. And I think it's super important work because we really need people to understand what worked and what didn't work. And why did we get the different outcomes in the different countries? Because it makes a big difference to lives and livelihoods. So,
and if you wanted to build on that, I will say the FTC has announced that it is engaged in an international cooperative reassessment of antitrust in the pharmaceutical space. And that, if you're an early grad student, you know, seeing where that goes and seeing if there are some shocks that come out, policy shocks that come out of that, and how it influences, you know, everything from merger activity to outcomes in pharma could also be interesting.
Yeah, I think this is an area where, from a public policy point of view, it would be extraordinarily valuable to have more insights into this. And I think for any graduate student, there's a natural interest in these topics right now, and this is not going away over the next few years. There's going to be a lot of interest in this, and there's just been so much change that it just seems like there would be a lot of opportunities there. So thanks to Sam, to Nancy, to Cary for a really lively and interesting discussion. Thanks to members of the audience for sending in the questions. I couldn't get to all of them, but I tried to get a few of them in. And thanks to the Stigler Center for honoring George at the 50th of this paper. And my guess is we'll be talking about this for another 50 years. Thank you very much. And and this is of course just the first day of the panel of the conference. Please join the Stigler Center again tomorrow for a very interesting keynote. I think it's by Cass Sunstein, and then a panel that follow after that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.